I never imagined one simple decision would spiral into a story I would carry for the rest of my life. It began on an unassuming afternoon when I drove across town with a mix of curiosity and nervous anticipation. The man I thought I was meeting that day had been someone I trusted, someone who made me feel heard and understood during a time when my own marriage felt distant. His name was Michael. I believed he had the answers to the confusion I was facing in my heart, but what happened when I stepped through his front door revealed far more about life, choices, and consequences than I could have prepared for. Michael was older than me, a man who had a quiet confidence that seemed to draw people in. He wasn't showy, wasn't the type to boast, but there was something about his calm way of listening that made me forget the noise in my head. My marriage to Daniel, my husband, had been on rocky ground for months. Daniel was a good man, but his job as a contractor kept him away long hours, and when he was home, his mind was often still on the worksite. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table many nights, staring at my untouched coffee, wondering if he even noticed how far apart we had drifted. That's when Michael came into my life. We met at a community fundraiser. He was a widower, charming in a quiet, careful way. He struck up a conversation about the books I was looking at on a raffle table, and before I knew it, we were meeting for coffee now and then. It felt innocent at first, just two adults talking, two people who seemed to understand each other in a way our daily lives didn't allow. I never admitted to myself that I was seeking something more until the day he invited me over. His words had been simple. "Why don't you stop by? We can talk without the noise of the cafe. I make a mean pot of coffee at home." I hesitated, but a part of me longed for that quiet connection. So, on a Saturday afternoon when Daniel was away working a job out of town, I told myself I was just going to talk, just going to sort out my feelings with someone who cared enough to listen. I pulled into his driveway, heart pounding harder than I expected. His house was modest but well kept, with a neat lawn and an old oak tree shading the porch. I paused for a long moment before stepping out of my car. I told myself to breathe, to remember that this was just a conversation. When I rang the doorbell, I half expected Michael's familiar face to greet me. But when the door opened, it wasn't Michael at all. Standing there was his son, Ethan. Ethan was younger than me by a few years, in his late 20s. I had seen him once before in passing, but never spoken to him. He had his father's striking eyes, but a more restless energy about him. He leaned against the doorframe, clearly surprised. "You must be Mrs. Parker, right? Dad's friend from the fundraiser?" he asked with a half-smile. I nodded, suddenly unsure of myself.
"Yes."
"Is your father home?" Ethan shook his head. "He ran out to pick up a few things. But he'll be back soon. You can come in if you'd like." I stepped inside, the living room neat but lived in, photographs of their family lining the mantel. Ethan motioned for me to sit, and I tried to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. Something about his expression felt curious, almost knowing, like he understood more than he should. As I sat there, he brought me a glass of water without asking, and then he sat across from me. "So," he said casually, "you and Dad have gotten close, huh?" The way he asked the question made me flush. "We're just friends," I said quickly, my voice a little too defensive. Ethan tilted his head, studying me with a mix of amusement and seriousness. "Friends," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word. "My dad doesn't bring many people around anymore, especially women. He's been, well, kind of closed off since Mom passed. But you," he paused. "You're different." I shifted in my seat, uncomfortable under his gaze. "I don't know what you mean." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I mean, I see the way you look at him, and I see the way he talks about you. You're not just some random friend, are you?" My heart raced. This wasn't the conversation I had come for. I had wanted to talk to Michael, to find clarity, maybe even to test the lines of my marriage in the quiet safety of his presence. But here was Ethan, his son, forcing me to confront the reality of what I was doing. Before I could answer, the front door opened. Michael walked in, carrying a bag of groceries. His face lit up when he saw me, but then his eyes flicked to Ethan, and a strange tension filled the air. "Dad," Ethan said smoothly, "your friend stopped by. We've been chatting." Michael's smile faltered just slightly as he glanced between us. I thought I saw something like concern in his eyes, but he quickly covered it with warmth. "I'm glad you came," he said, setting the groceries down. "Why don't we sit in the kitchen?" We moved into the kitchen, but Ethan lingered nearby, leaning against the counter as though unwilling to leave us alone. It made the air feel heavy. Every word I spoke weighed down by his presence. Michael made coffee, and we sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. He asked how I was doing, about Daniel, about the things I had been struggling with. His voice was steady, soothing, and for a moment I forgot Ethan was even there. But then Ethan spoke up from the counter. "You know, Dad, maybe she doesn't just need someone to listen. Maybe she needs someone to make her feel alive again." The words cut through the air like a knife. My face burned, and Michael shot his son a sharp look. "That's enough, Ethan." Ethan only shrugged, but his eyes stayed on me, challenging me, almost daring me to admit something I hadn't said out loud. That moment changed everything. I realized with sudden clarity that I was standing at the edge of a dangerous path. Whatever I thought I had been searching for with Michael was already complicated, but Ethan's presence magnified the consequences. I wasn't just playing with my own heart. I was tangled in a family, a father and son both watching me with very different expectations. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy conversation. Michael tried to steer things back to safe topics, but the tension lingered. When I finally stood to leave, Michael walked me to the door. He looked at me with a gentleness that made my chest ache. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said softly. "And think carefully about what you really want." Ethan's eyes followed me as I stepped out, and the weight of his unspoken words stayed with me long after I drove away. That night, I lay awake in bed beside Daniel, who was finally home, snoring softly after a long day of work. I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying every detail. Michael's kindness, Ethan's boldness, the way I had been searching for something outside the marriage I had once promised to protect. For the first time, I saw my choices not as small, private escapes, but as waves that could ripple through lives far beyond my own. In the weeks that followed, I pulled back from Michael. I couldn't bring myself to step into that house again, knowing the storm that simmered beneath its roof. Instead, I began focusing on my marriage, forcing myself to have the hard conversations with Daniel that I had avoided for too long. I told him how lonely I had felt, how invisible, how desperate I had been for connection. To my surprise, he listened, really listened, for the first time in months. It wasn't easy.